Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third of these lectures. I am Serene Jones, the president here at Union Theological Seminary. And this evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Robert Wright, who is a visiting professor of science and religion here at Union. It is science and religion, not religion and science, to be carefully noted. We can explore what that means. And he is here for 18 months on a grant from the Templeton Foundation. You have heard much, if you've been here for the two previous lectures, about his long list of accomplishments as a journalist, an author, a leading thinker, works like Nonzero, The Evolution of God, now his project entitled The Meaning of Life TV. All of these are tied together by a unique vision, although perhaps not as unique as some would like to think it is, but a vision that Robert has for a new way of envisioning the interplay between science and religion in such a way that the findings, the insights, the explorations of science not only support, but in fact expand and deepen many of the deepest principles and practices embedded in religious traditions. And what we are privy to in this series of 5 lectures is Robert laying out for us his worldview. Now, how many people get a chance to give 5 lectures on your worldview for the world to participate in hearing and giving feedback on? The series is called The New Agnosticism and Its Spiritual Implications. And tonight we are going to hear the third of those talks, and the title is The Force is With Us, History, Game Theory, and Moral Progress. So I'm delighted to invite Robert forward.
Well, thank you very much, Serene. I first met Serene a few years ago at a conference in England, and I was sitting next to her, and when I heard her accent, I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Oklahoma." And I said, "Oh, really? I was born in Oklahoma." And she said, "You were?" And the rest is history. It turns out that the sole criterion for getting an appointment at Union is having been born in Oklahoma. I mean, it's you laugh, but Cornel West was actually born in Oklahoma. That's a true fact, so connect the dots. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I also want to thank John Horgan, famous author and science writer, blogger for Scientific American, who is going to come up after my talk and brutally interrogate me. Now, I want to start tonight with a question that probably wasn't on your mind as you came here tonight, which is, why have we not been contacted by extraterrestrial beings? Believe it or not, some very thoughtful people consider this a very good question. In fact, an increasingly good question. And there's a logic behind the question from their point of view, a kind of a logic of growing power, and it's this. Lately, we have been discovering a growing number of nearby solar systems that seem to have planets that would be hospitable to life in principle. And the theory goes, surely on some of these planets you would get self-replicating molecules of the kind that gave birth to natural selection. So if you saw the same story unfolded on planet Earth, you'd eventually get intelligent beings. And if on some of these planets, these intelligent beings were, even a few centuries ahead of us technologically, that would be like way ahead of us given the rate of technological change. So surely they would have the power to reach out to us, right? So why haven't they? There's a couple of possible answers. One is that the assumptions underlying the question are faulty. So you might argue, for example, that actually natural selection is not that likely to increase to lead to intelligent life. That was just a fluke on our planet. I think that answer's wrong. I think actually natural selection was likely to lead to intelligent life. There's a second answer that is, depending on how you look at it, either horrifyingly depressing or darkly inspiring. I'm going to save that answer for the end, partly to keep you on the edge of your seats, and partly because I hope my talk tonight will set the context for it. Okay, so Those of you who have been here for the last couple of talks are probably not surprised to hear me talking in such kind of cosmic terms about the whole history of life and so on, because, as you know, in these 5 lectures, I'm laying out the elements of a spiritual worldview that is not just compatible with science, but is grounded in science. And I said last week that one element that a lot of spiritual traditions have is a kind of a cosmic narrative, right? A story about history that places the human experience in a context that gives people a sense of meaning, of moral orientation, maybe of individual purpose. And tonight, and to some extent next Tuesday night, I'm going to be presenting my version of such a worldview. Now, I am operating under some constraints compared to the great spiritual traditions in constructing a kind of cosmic narrative, because I can't claim any special revelation or anything. I can't look to Scripture for a story to tell you. I am confined to just science and reasonable philosophical speculation. And in kind of as a way of kind of highlighting how these constraints matter, tonight I'd like to compare my worldview with the worldview of someone who does not operate under these constraints, and yet whose kind of cosmic story has a lot in common with mine, okay? And you will see his picture if it turns out that this PowerPoint thing is working. There. So Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic philosopher and in some sense theologian. Now, as a Christian, he could confidently assert that his story of history was a manifestation of divine purpose. I can't confidently assert that. However, his account was very different from any traditional Christian account based on the Bible. So, he was born in the late 19th century and thought and wrote in the early 20th century, so he was writing after Darwin and was very cognizant of evolution. In fact, he was a paleontologist, he was a scientist, and he was also cognizant of some technological trends that are still unfolding today and that he put a lot of emphasis on, and that I put a lot of emphasis on. Now, he made a kind of remarkable claim. He said that the human species is becoming a superorganism. Okay, now superorganism is a term biologists use for when a social species is so kind of cohesive in its social organization that it almost resembles a single organism. And he said humanity was becoming a superorganism in some sense, a single organism. Let me show you some things he said by way of backing that up. He said humankind is coming gradually to form around itself, its earthly matrix, a single major organic unity enclosed upon itself. Channels of electronic communication are forming a generalized nervous system emanating from certain defined centers and covering the entire surface of the globe. So we are being woven into, quote, a brain of brains. And he coined this term noosphere to refer to the thinking envelope of the work of the earth. That's the first syllable comes from the Greek word for mind, and he contrasted that with the biosphere. So you've got the biosphere and then this kind of mind increasingly surrounding it and assuming stewardship of it. Now, I think it was kind of prescient to start talking about humanity constructing a giant global brain, more than 50 years before I had heard the word internet, right? I do think you have to acknowledge that he was ahead of his time. Now, he wasn't talking, when he talked about a superorganism, he wasn't just talking about the external kind of structural aspect of it, that it looked like a superorganism. He was talking about its internal life as well. He was talking about consciousness. He had emphasized in his thinking that there is a correlation in his view, between biological complexity and kind of richness of consciousness, of sentience, of subjective experience. This was a big theme of his. And he thought that as kind of organic organization made this leap to the global level, consciousness would in some sense follow. He said that we were starting to get a, quote, a sort of etherized universal consciousness. By etherized, he doesn't mean drugged, he means, you know, kind of out there in the ether, I guess. I haven't been able to tell exactly what he meant by all this, but he certainly meant, at a minimum, that, you know, as events in the world are broadcast around the world and we all get them at more or less the same time, that there's more and more common sentiment in response to them. And it's also clear, whatever he meant by global consciousness, it's also clear that he meant that this increasingly unified consciousness would be cemented by growing sympathy and love. So, a couple more things he said. Humanity is building its composite brain beneath our eyes. May it not be that tomorrow, through the logical and biological deepening of the movement drawing it together, it will find its heart, without which the ultimate wholeness of its powers of unification can never be fully achieved. Must not the constructive developments now taking place within the noosphere in the realm of sight and reason necessarily penetrate to the sphere of feeling? He realized that this might seem implausible. He wrote, "The idea may seem fantastic when one looks at our present world still dominated by the forces of hatred and repulsion, but is not this simply because we refuse to heed the admonitions of science, which is daily proving to us in every field that seemingly impossible change has become easy and even inevitable when there is a change in the order of the dimensions?" So, inevitable and easy. He's being somewhat more optimistic than I would be about this, and so I want to explain why that is by laying out my own view of history. Before I do that, I want to kind of jump ahead in a sense and do a quick compare and contrast between his worldview and the worldview that you're going to hear from me, because I really want to be clear on some points of commonality and some points of contrast, even before I get into detail about my own worldview. So, some questions you can ask about the co-evolutionary process. You know, biological evolution and then the subsequent cultural evolution, to include technological evolution that biological evolution spawned. Some of you having trouble seeing the screen? No, you're okay? Are you just being polite? Being polite? That's good. The world needs that. Okay, so does it have direction? Yes. We both think that biological evolution was likely to result in intelligent life, complexity was likely to grow, and also that social complexity was likely to grow, so that globalization was a likely outcome. A moral direction, yes. I'll get to the sense in which I mean that. He meant it in the sense I've mentioned, that among other senses maybe, but he certainly expected growth in love and sympathy among human beings and bonding. Is the explanation mechanistic? In his case, I would say not entirely. In other words, does he have a strictly scientific materialist explanation of these two evolutionary processes? As far as biological evolution goes, he certainly believed in natural selection. There's some controversy over whether he thought natural selection was being supplemented by some sort of immaterial force. But in any event, he certainly seems to believe that as human history progresses, it's getting a kind of assist from the beyond, from kind of transcendent space. He had this term called the omega point. It was conceived as this thing that is in some sense kind of drawing humankind toward its destiny. So that's a difference. Is there a larger purpose unfolding? He, of course, said yes, being a Christian. I say possibly, and I want to emphasize that there's not a contradiction between those last two lines. It is possible to have a mechanistic explanation of evolution and subsequent events and still think that there's some larger purpose unfolding. In other words, you can have a machine that works in accordance with physical laws in clearly intelligible fashion, and yet it was set in motion in some sense for some purpose. I'm going to get into this more next week and get into some reasons, some actual evidence I see that this may be the case, although, of course, I can't be sure. So, and finally, will there be a happy ending? He seems to think so. I, again, am less sure. And to see the grounds for both my optimism and my pessimism, it helps to tell you what my view of history is, I guess. Now, the title of this talk is a Force with Us? And the term may surprise you. Force may sound more like one of Teilhard's terms than mine, right? It sounds like immaterial forces, divine forces. But, of course, scientists use the word force to refer to the physical world. Social scientists refer to dynamics that are so powerful and systematic that we can refer to them as forces. And I want to talk about a dynamic in history that is best described, I think, by game theory. So I'm going to give you a quick little tutorial in game theory, but in any event, that's what I mean by force, the logic of game theory playing out. So a zero-sum game, there's a basic distinction between zero-sum and non-zero-sum games. A zero-sum game is a game in which there's a winner and a loser, and everything that happens is, to the extent that it's good for one, it's bad for the other. So if you're playing tennis with somebody, every point, your fortunes are exactly inversely correlated on every point. It's good for one, bad for the other by exactly the same extent. If you're playing doubles, then the person on the same side of the net with you is playing a non-zero-sum game with you, because every point is either good for both of you, win-win outcome, or bad for both of you, lose-lose outcome. Your fortunes are perfectly correlated. They don't have to be perfectly correlated for it to be a non-zero-sum game, but there can't be a consistent inverse correlation if it's going to be a non-zero-sum game. So there are lots of non-zero-sum games in real life, a lot of them in economics. If you go buy something, it means you would rather have the merchandise than the money. The merchant would rather have the money than the merchandise. You both feel you came out ahead. Division of labor is a common manifestation of non-zero-sum dynamics. Steve Wozniak was good at building computers. Steve Jobs wasn't, but he was good at designing them and marketing them. They get together and, wealth ensues. So through non-zero-sum interaction, two people can get together and in some sense create more than the sum of their parts. Now, we seem to be engineered by natural selection to play non-zero-sum games. And the way you can tell is if you meet someone and find that you have a common interest, you will feel yourself warming up to them a little, probably, right? You share the same political views, you have the same hobby. If you pay attention, you'll see that you're starting to feel warmly toward them, in at least some measure. And it makes sense, right? Because if you share this interest, then the two of you can play a non-zero-sum game. You can get together and play golf. If you both like golf, you can unite to pursue the same political cause. You can share information about the political cause. Very common form of non-zero-sum interaction is just a sharing of information that brings value to both parties. And of course possibly the deepest bonding experience of all is to find that your common interest is that you both dislike the same person, right? I mean, if you both have the same rival or adversary, we're talking about serious warmth, right? And, makes sense, from natural selection's point of view, if you have the same adversary, you have something in common. You can jointly pursue this mission of undermining them or fending them off or whatever you have to do. Now, if you think about the way you feel toward that adversary or enemy, of course, it's the opposite of warmth, and this suggests that natural selection also designed us to play zero-sum games as well. And much of our emotional infrastructure, if you start paying attention, has to do with being engineered to navigate a landscape of zero-sum and non-zero-sum games. And this is actually one sense in which game theoretical dynamics can be thought of as a force. They actually explain attraction and repulsion in human society. But the main sense in which I mean to think of game theoretical dynamics as a force is that I think their unfolding through history helps explain certain things, most notably a growth in social complexity, in the depth and scale of social complexity. I think they help explain why 15,000 years ago, every society was a hunter-gatherer society. Today, we are on the brink of globalization. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you ask anthropologists, why are these hunter-gatherers living in a village? Why don't they just live, independently in families? Why are there 100, 150 of them living together? The anthropologists will list a series of reasons that all boil down to non-zero-sum dynamics. So together they can fend off predators better. Well, that means there's a non-zero-sum relationship among them. If they can cooperate to that end, they can hunt big game, or they can swap food. So I have no food this week, you give me some, you have no food next week, I give you some, we both avoid dying. That's a win-win outcome. All the classically stated advantages for social organization are non-zero-sum dynamics to begin with. And my basic argument about the growth of social complexity is that new technologies come along that facilitate or otherwise encourage the playing of non-zero-sum games in more elaborate fashion, often with more people, often over larger and larger distances, and social complexity grows in response. Okay? So let me give some examples. There's one that I'll give you that's kind of just a snapshot, a kind of real-time example, so to speak. The Shoshone Native Americans in the western United States were described by Mark Twain, quite unfairly, I think, as the wretchedest type of mankind I have ever seen. They have no villages and no gathering together into strictly defined tribal communities. Well, it's true that they spend a certain amount of time foraging just at the family level, just individual families foraging, but sometimes rabbits would be available for hunting in profusion, and they would employ a technology called a rabbit net, and that called for large-scale organization. So some people had made the net, some people had to man the net, some people had to chase the rabbits into the net, some people had to beat the rabbits, and so on. And you wound up with 10 or 12 families suddenly on this elaborate collaborative endeavor. They even appointed a rabbit boss. And what that illustrates is just that, human nature, we just very readily respond to technological opportunities to play non-zero-sum games with each other. Now, an obviously big threshold in technological evolution was farming. Among other things, it permitted people to live much closer together than in a hunter-gatherer society. The population density grew tremendously. This created the opportunity for more non-zero-sum games, more elaborate division of labor, more sharing of information among more people. And you do see, with the coming of farming, the development of these so-called chiefdoms, these multi-village polities, typically with centralized leadership. The leader is called a chief, I guess logically enough. And chiefs went to great lengths to establish their dominance. They often succeeded in convincing people that they were kind of the unique channel to the divine, or that they were themselves divine. So the Natchez Native Americans in southeastern United States, that was a chiefdom, and the commoners who were lucky enough to accompany the chief into the afterlife if the chief died would swallow enough tobacco to lose consciousness and then be ritually strangled. Well, I would not say that was a win-win outcome, and I want to pause here and emphasize this, that to say that non-zero-sum dynamics have grown is not to say that there's no exploitation or no inequities. It's not even in itself to say that they've been reduced or that they haven't increased, okay? Because, technically, if there's 10 people, they're producing 10 pounds of food, somebody comes along with an innovation, now they're producing 20 pounds of food a week, but the additional 10 pounds are all consumed by the chief, that's still technically a non-zero-sum game, because the innovation didn't lead to zero, it led to something above zero, regardless of how it was parceled out. So I want to emphasize that I'm not cheerleading for history here, and to say that there has been a growth in non-zero-sumness, which I think there in some sense undeniably has been, is not to say that history has been a succession of smiley face stickers, or that there's or that the fight for justice is over, or anything like that. So you might imagine information technologies are very important in non-zero-sum games. I mean, after all, you can have contracts with people. You can have peace treaties, you can send letters all the way around the world. You can do a lot of things, and as it happens, the invention of information technology, of writing, tends to correspond with the development of the so-called state-level society, city-states in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Mayan civilization, Aztec civilization. They all had systems of writing. But I do want to emphasize that I am not saying, when I talk about technological evolution abetting the growth of non-zero-sumness, I'm not saying that it's always a case of technology kind of mediating the playing of a non-zero-sum game, the way information technology often does. And there's an example of this from the Bible. So the Israelites, apparently, according to the Bible, encountered the Philistines. Now, today the word Philistines means, people who don't go to the Museum of Modern Art or something, people who don't have culture. And these Philistines, probably did not go to the Museum of Modern Art, but they did have a kind of culture, a kind of cultural advance. They had iron weapons. The Israelites didn't. So the Israelites were getting slaughtered on the battlefield. According to the Bible, they convened and said, we got to up our game here. And they made the conscious decision to move from a loosely federated bunch of tribes to a kind of a state-level society. We need a king, we need taxes, we need conscription, and so on. According to the Bible, that was a conscious decision. In any event, what it illustrates is that another sense in which history is not a succession of smiley-face stickers is that the growth in non-zero-sumness I'm talking about has sometimes been abetted by war between societies. That leads to a more non-zero-sum dynamic within the societies because the stakes of cohesion and collaboration get higher. So another unfortunate thing about reality. Okay, so anyway, that's the basic argument. Technologies come along that facilitate or encourage more elaborate non-zero-sum games involving more people over greater expanses. Social complexity grows in scope or depth to accommodate, to take advantage of the technologies. And then every once in a while, an actual threshold in social organization is crossed. You get chiefdoms, city-states, regional states, empires. And now we are, I think, entering another threshold, right? We have the possibility of actually moving toward a cohesive, peaceful global society. As for what we might do to increase the chances of actually getting there, I will spare you a long sermon on global governance and the need to respect international law, and I will just give you the 60-second version. Most of the problems that argue for global governance, for an institutionalized form of cooperation among nations, are just non-zero-sum problems. So climate change, many nations face the same problem. They cannot effectively confront it alone, so there's a logic behind collaboration. When diseases cross borders, multiple nations have a stake in doing something about that. When economic problems spread by contagion, and so on. What's true of all these things is the fortunes of people at great distances are correlated to some extent, okay? And this isn't always obvious. It's true in just a lot of different ways. I mean, we're finding out lately that kind of instability and destruction and suffering in the Middle East or in Africa can come back to America in the form of terrorism, okay? In general, simmering hatreds around the world can harm people in the United States. I personally think, hatred should be thought of as almost public enemy number one. There's still not a sufficient appreciation of what a bad thing hatred just is for everyone when it exists anywhere. Herbert Spencer said, no man can be perfectly happy until all are happy. Well, I do think we're getting, just as a descriptive matter, a little closer to that. I think more and more the welfare of people around the world depends on kind of the welfare of each other, including people very, very far away. Okay, so enough about global governance. This is mainly a talk about moral progress, moral direction. So what do I mean by moral progress? Well, I mean roughly what Peter Singer means in his book, The Expanding Circle, if you can see that. It was published in 1981. by expanding circle, what he means is that there has been an expansion kind of the circle of moral consideration, you might say. So he gives an example in the book. So there was a time, 500 BCE or so, when back when members of one Greek city-state considered members of another Greek city-state subhuman, but then they made some moral progress. They decided all Greeks are human. It's just the Persians who are not human. Well, it was progress, right? I mean, it's something. And in Peter's telling, there was more progress to come. So you get, larger and larger expanses within which, everyone is considered human. Obviously, there's been a lot of backsliding, and there remain pockets of resistance. But I think it's true. Everyone here would say, that people everywhere, regardless of race, creed, color, gender, etc., deserve to be treated as human beings. They have human rights. They deserve to be treated decently. We take it for granted, maybe. It doesn't seem so exceptional. But, if you go back very far in history, it really is the exception and not the norm. And there are many places around the world where that's true. Although, again, there certainly remain pockets of resistance and backsliding. So, Peter Singer's explanation of this has a lot to do with the power of human reason. We kind of reason our way to the logic of granting people what you would expect from people in the way of treatment. And I think there's something to that. But I think reason has gotten a big assist from the expanding web of non-zero-sum connection. I mean, as we've seen, it's natural to feel an affinity for people with whom you're in a non-zero-sum relationship. Natural both in the sense that it happens almost instinctively, but also in the sense that if you think about it, it just makes sense. I mean, if you're going to collaborate with somebody on something, do business with them, obviously you should not start out by telling them they're not a human being, right? I mean, that's just not smart, and we're not inclined to do it. So I think the growth in this moral circle has something to do with that non-zero-sum logic. And in fact, if you look at what was going on in Greece when they decided that they were all humans, there were intermittent wars with the Persians. So things were more non-zero-sum on the Greek side. They had a bigger stake in collaboration. In modern history, I think you can see this dynamic at work. If you see the transformation in the American view of Japanese people, for example, in World War II, media featured literally subhuman depictions of Japanese people. We locked up Japanese Americans with no compunction, so far as I can tell. Dropped a bomb on Hiroshima with, so far as I can tell, virtually no anguish about the thing. Then after World War II, suddenly we're friends, and there is non-zero-sum logic here. We are allies in the Cold War against the Russians. We're trading with the Japanese, and I think, all these things cement a more humane attitude. Again, there can be backsliding in the late 80s and early 90s when Japan was suddenly seen as this big economic threat. You got books like Rising Sun by Michael Crichton, which was turned into a movie, and suddenly Japanese were depicted as like insidious and wily and threatening. And I should emphasize that even when relations between two nations are in the aggregate non-zero sum, that doesn't mean there aren't real zero-sum dynamics at an individual level. So American workers are not imagining that their jobs are threatened by foreign workers sometimes when trade happens, even if in the aggregate there are benefits flowing to both nations, and it's non-zero-sum in that technical sense. I mean, again, non-zero-sumness says nothing about the equity of distribution in and of itself. And, similarly, workers may indeed be in competition with immigrants for their jobs. But when this happens, when you see a zero-sum, of the perception of a zero-sum relationship, I think you see the moral vision kind of contract accordingly, right? So look at the way Donald Trump talks about Mexicans to constituents who feel threatened by Mexicans, right? And I guess if there's any good thing to be taken away from the way he does that, it's that he does seem to feel compelled not to be too explicit and comprehensive in the bigotry, right? He says they're bringing over rapists and so on, but some of them are good people, right? And now, if you go back 150 years, it was very common to just condemn entire ethnic groups and call them subhuman. So at least maybe we've created an environment in which, at least for the time being, you can only get away with so much on the bigotry front. But anyway, this illustrates the point that the perception of a zero-sum or non-zero-sum dynamic does a lot to influence your kind of moral view of other people. So I think it's good that there are a lot of non-zero-sum dynamics floating around the world, not just in the realm of economics. I mean, there are these so-called hobby tribes, right, where people play chess with people over in other countries and get to know each other, and a lot of this is good. So, you know, in a sense, what I'm saying is that the moral circle has expanded partly as a reflection of self-interest. It has become in people's interest to acknowledge the humanity of other people. And that may seem like a cynical view of moral enlightenment, but I'd rather people be pushed in that way through self-interest toward moral truth than not move toward it at all. Of course, I would love to see the unfolding of Teilhard's vision, where what you have is a more robust profusion of actual love and active sympathy for people. I'm a big fan of love, as many of us are. I actually believe you can literally make an argument from a scientific standpoint, a Darwinian standpoint, that love is truth. And I'll be talking about that in the 5th lecture, which is a week from Thursday. You know, and I hope we will see more of the Teilhardian vision unfold, even as the more pragmatic, maybe cynical even, version of moral progress, I hope, continues to unfold. Now, I don't want to overstate the differences between Teilhard's vision in mind. He did sometimes talk about people having a common interest and warming to one another in response to that. And he paid particular attention to a group that he called Homo progressivus, which he defined as people who consider the future of the earth more important than the present. They think more about the future than the present. And here's what he said about Homo progressivus. He said, "Some apparent attraction draws these scattered elements together and causes them to unite among themselves. They will gravitate instinctively towards one another in the crowd. No racial, social, or religious barrier seems to be effective against this force of attraction. I myself have experienced this 100 times. Regardless of the country, creed, or social status of the person I approach, provided the same flame of expectation burns in us both, there is a profound, definitive, and total contact instantly established between us." Now, I suspect that by Homo progressivus, he means roughly what I mean when I have occasionally used the term the tribeless tribe. Now, tribeless tribe is not a formal thing. It doesn't, as far as I know, exist. I would like it to exist and grow, but what I mean by the tribeless tribe is people whose fundamental commitment is to the welfare of humankind, okay? It doesn't mean they cannot have another tribal affiliation. They can have a religious affiliation, a national affiliation, an ethnic affiliation. It's just that these things are not paramount, and these things assume benign forms, so they don't involve antagonism, serious antagonism with others, and they're compatible with pursuing the welfare of humankind broadly. I think this roughly corresponds to his Homo progressivus, but I think there may be a difference between the way we're looking at this. I think Teilhard thought that Homo progressivus had an inherent advantage in the long run over the more destructive tribes whose influence Homo progressivus hoped to pursue. In fact, if you look at, we'll see if this works. Yeah. If you look at his language here, some apparent attraction draws these scattered elements together. They will gravitate instinctively towards one another in the crowd. It's almost as if there's a kind of a mystical force. It's like before they even have a chance to talk and know that they share the same values, it's like a secret handshake or something, except that it happens at long distance, And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that this would be a manifestation of what I talked about, point omega, this transcendent thing that is drawing humankind morally forward. And so I kind of think he thinks that Homo progressivus, the force is on their side in a sense in which I'm not so confident that the force is on their side. And of course, this was presumably based in his religious faith. I don't have the luxury of that kind of faith. I don't see the tribeless tribe having an inherent edge over the more destructive tribes. In fact, if you were here for some of the earlier lectures, I'm deeply concerned about various kinds of tribalism, sectarian tribalism, nationalistic tribalism, ethnic tribalism, even ideological tribalism, as we're seeing in the United States. I think all of these things are bound by just the psychology of tribalism, which is a product of natural selection. And I think it's a great peril to humankind. And it's why I think that if our species is going to cross the threshold to a cohesive global community, it's going to take something that I call a spiritual discipline in one sense or another. My own favorite spiritual discipline is meditation. And I'll talk about that too a little in the fifth lecture. But there are various spiritual disciplines. There's prayer. There's all kinds of spiritual disciplines. I would say in a certain sense, even totally secular therapeutic practices can qualify for spiritual disciplines if they're put to this specific end of, overcoming the various cognitive biases, the various distortions of thought and perception that constitute the psychology of tribalism. And the reason I think they qualify for the term spiritual discipline is I think the problem is so stubborn that it calls for a disciplined practice to address it. And also, anything that brings you closer to moral truth, as I think this would, I think qualifies for the term spiritual. Now, I want to show you a little cartoon. Before I give you the answer to the aliens question and we wrap up, I want to show you a little cartoon that covers the whole history of the planet that Teilhard de Chardin and I more or less agree on. We agree on 99% of this cartoon. Okay, so strands of self-replicating material, DNA, they form cells. You get societies of cells. The cells come together to form multicellular organisms. You get societies of multicellular organisms. You get one that becomes very smart, so smart that they launch technological evolution. You get hunter-gatherer villages, chiefdoms. You get, city-states. You get transportation technologies like horses. People venture forth, contact other civilizations. Yes, they fight, but they trade. They engage in commerce. The expanse of social organization grows. Before you know it, you've got globalization, giant global brain. Question is what happens? It's the question mark that Teilhard de Chardin and I disagree on. He's pretty sure that the outcome is happy. I'm not. Okay, so now some of you, by the way, the story, as for why I'm a little less optimistic than Teilhard, there's a little story behind this animation that kind of explains it. So this was actually created by a guy in Russia, a young guy named Nikita Petrov, at my suggestion. And the way I met him was he took an online course I taught in Buddhism and modern psychology. So we came into contact, and we found that we shared values. I'd like to think we're both members of Homo progressivus, or the tribeless tribe, and we have warm feelings toward one another. Not just because we're collaborating on things, but because we do share values. And this is the kind of thing Teilhard would point to. It's wonderful, right? That technology can bring you in touch, in sympathetic contact with people halfway around the world. At the same time, the same technology is helping other tribes congeal, right? Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these far-right nativist parties in Europe, some of whom are no doubt in touch with some people in the Donald Trump coalition. All this is spreading across borders as well. And all of this is happening in the context of, weapons of mass destruction that remain uncontrolled and in some ways proliferate. So to get back to the aliens question, some of you may have guessed the answer. It may be the case that when civilizations get to this level of social organization, they fail to make the requisite moral progress to kind of close the deal and instead just blow themselves up, okay? I don't want to bring you down, but when I said that this could be viewed as darkly inspiring, as well as just depressing, what I meant was, it underscores the challenge, right? Okay, so maybe most civilizations fail. That, to me, that just makes me think we should redouble the effort. And I think it helps in redoubling the effort to just take stock of how long it's taken us to get where we are. I mean, from cellular level of organization to verge of globalization, that was a lot of work. That was, and it would be a shame if we blew it now. I think we owe all the organisms who worked so hard to get us here a better outcome than that. And I also think we should reflect on what an amazing story it has been. Okay, so you've gotten this growth in biological complexity. As Teilhard de Chardin emphasized, this has entailed a growth in kind of the richness of consciousness, of subjective experience, and I'm personally very grateful for that. You can imagine a planet where it's just robots evolving, don't have an interior life. I much prefer this one. Moreover, we have feelings like love, empathy, compassion, and we now know that these are actually built in by natural selection, which is, kind of ironic in a way, since natural selection is thought of as a dog-eat-dog process, but we now understand why there is, altruism and the corresponding feelings of empathy, compassion, why there is love. This is something we have going for us. Now, it is true that, we are not naturally inclined to deploy these moral sentiments in what you might call morally optimal fashion. In fact, we're inclined to deploy them along what you might call tribal lines in a metaphorical sense of that term, but we're inclined naturally to not deploy them as broadly and as equitably as I think would be in conformity to what's right and to moral truth. This is just an unfortunate thing we're left with by virtue of our creative process, natural selection. But we can, through scientific reflection and spiritual reflection, in principle, gain the self-knowledge and self-mastery to deploy our moral sentiments in closer conformity to moral truth. And, if enough people do this, it could literally save the world. So I think we should. I think we can, in principle. And just to try to sustain this this upbeat, this little upbeat note I've uncharacteristically ended on, I'm going to play this cartoon again. Okay, so still a question mark, but now the answer is yes, we can. Okay, so thank you. John is now going to come up here and interrogate me. Don't bring us down, man. Thank you.
Thing. So Bob happens to be married to a childhood friend of mine named Lisa O'Neill. I think they met about 30 years ago, and so I found out that this friend of mine is is dating this guy who was a science writer, as I was, and still am. And when I first met Bob, I thought he was a little bit of a know-it-all, obviously a very smart guy. But what I realized pretty quickly was that our interests are remarkably similar. You know, Bob really is obsessed, I think it's fair to say, with the biggest questions. What's the meaning of life? Is truth attainable? Is there a God? And what sort of God is it, if there is a God? And I feel very privileged to have known Bob now for 30 years. He's actually a great guy.
You sound as if they should be surprised by that.
He said, well, because he can be very tough as an intellectual. He can have a real edge, although I think the meditation thing is working for him.
Also age.
But yes, age. That's my path. Just getting older. And so it's been wonderful for me to see Bob engage with some of these big questions that I also am wrestling with. And what I've realized we disagree on a lot of things, but I think it's more important to agree on what's important to think about. It's more important to agree on the questions than the answers. Although we actually agree on a lot of things. And what I wanted to do just to get things going is to spell out a couple of areas of agreement, and then I feel obliged to disagree on something important, and I'm going to do that, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But also I want to point out that there are some similarities between us. We both grew up in Christian homes. I think you're Baptist. I grew up Catholic. I started having problems with Catholicism by my early teens. Maybe one difference between us is that I'm a little older than Bob. Is this?
No, you're good.
Does this sound okay?
I just want to make sure.
So I was kind of a 60s child, and I took a lot of psychedelic drugs, and that had a big impact on my spirituality, such as it is. I am still a Catholic in the sense that I think thinking about God and transcendent purpose and meaning and so forth, those are questions that I still find fascinating, and I can't get them out of my head. I even wrote a book called Rational Mysticism. Also, like Bob, I think that science is our most powerful way of understanding reality, and that if you have any kind of moral and spiritual worldview, it has to be consistent with science in some way. All right, and so I've tried to figure out how that's going to work in my own writing. My biggest point of agreement with Bob is that I'd say we're both optimists, and I think that puts us in the minority of people these days. It's extraordinary to me how depressed, how despairing. I mean, this preceded the current presidential election. Most people are really fatalistic about where humanity is headed, and so I am thrilled when a major intellectual like Bob lays out this really positive vision of humanity as definitely having an upward arc. And the thing is what bothers me when I meet other intellectuals who scoff at the very idea of progress, they can't, they have to put scare words or scare quotes around the word. I have to point out to them that progress is empirical. It's this massive trend. The world today, humanity today, is healthier, it's wealthier, it's more free, and believe it or not, it's more peaceful than it has been at almost any time in the history of civilization.
Proportionally, like violent deaths as a percentage of the overall.
Yes. and the percentage of people who are living under some kind of democracy is greater now, much greater than it was even 100 years ago. People are living longer. I mean, these aren't subtle trends. These are massive trends. Things are getting better in almost every important way. We should be concerned about global warming, but I moved to New York in 1980, and New York was filthy then. Some of you older people who lived in New York back then remember the Hudson River was disgusting. It was a cesspool. The air was so bad that your eyes would itch on some days, and that's not true anymore. I also agree with Bob, even though you didn't really talk about this, but I think it's important to bring up that, there's this current wave of religion bashing among some scientists, including somebody that was sitting right here a few months ago, the physicist Lawrence Krauss. And even if you're an atheist, I think it doesn't really serve much purpose just to tell religious people that they're idiots, which first of all is not true.
If I can interject, I mean, the people who have been here know that new atheist bashing has been a little bit of an obsession of mine in the earlier talks, in particular the first one. I just want to say that in terms of my issue with them is ultimately that's just one of the main ones, is that I think they are a tribe, the so-called new atheists. They act like a tribe, and there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but I think they exacerbate tribal antagonisms precisely by gratuitously offending religious people for no good reason. I'm not against the intellectual criticism of religious ideas or theology, but the gratuitous insulting of people, and not all of them do this. I don't hear Dan Dennett doing this, but some others I do. And in these earlier talks, I contrasted this with what I call the new agnosticism, and one of the principles I ascribed to that was just judging people by their behavior and not their beliefs. Okay, just kind of deed over creed, as the old saying goes. So
yeah, I completely agree. I am one of my greatest concerns now is the I think this is related to the point you were just making, the militarism of our society, and how the United States is, I think it's pretty obvious, is the most warlike society on the planet right now. We've got by far the biggest military, and we're the most aggressive in using it. And I think you would agree that we need to model better behavior. I think moral modeling can be an extremely powerful force. I think the United States can find some other ways to show how conflicts can be resolved than by bombing and droning and all these sorts of things.
And be more cognizant of how we are perceived and how things we do play out in perceptions abroad. I'm now doing a recap of past lectures, but the thing I emphasized last week was moral imagination, putting yourself in the shoes of others, and I think America, including American foreign policy, could use a lot more of that.
Yeah, and so I might be even more positive than you. That question mark at the end of their cartoon, I am, maybe it's reached the point of pathology, but I am really hopeful about the future. I think that we're at this turning point.
It has reached the point of pathology. You can seek help.
Well, I think that in the same way that the Soviet Union collapsed so quickly, mm-hmm. and relatively peacefully, that we're at this turning point in human history where if we get some enlightened leadership, and maybe that's asking a lot in this country right now.
That looks likely right now.
I still think it can happen. I was actually hopeful that Obama could do it, but that we could get past this current warlike period, which, relatively speaking, is still pretty modest. All right, but now I want to. So I actually think that some kind of fractious utopia is possible for us, even in our lifetimes. So now for the disagreement, and I'm not even sure how much of a disagreement it is, because you're so cagey about what you really think when it comes to God and the divine and all that sort of stuff.
Thank you.
You build a lot of deniability, I think, into your writing when you talk about these sort of things. But you started off with Desjardins, so this religious figure, and you obviously see some affinity to him. So the disagreement I have with you is why you need that stuff. Why you can't have a totally secular vision of human progress, which is mine. And by the way, I'm not an atheist because I often suspect, and this goes back to some of my psychedelic trips, but now it's something I feel all the time. This is all, it's hard to believe this is a coincidence. All this. And when you look at human history.
What do you mean by all this?
I mean, the fact that we're alive, reality, the human condition. It's just
that there is something rather than nothing, for starters.
That there is conscious life, that there are creatures like us who ponder their own existence, and that there has been this great adventure that humanity has been embarked on. I can't believe there's no concept of God that is coherent to me because of the problem of evil. Again, this is a throwback to my Catholic upbringing. So I have my suspicions, but I've decided that for practical reasons, it's just a bad idea to bring God into these discussions or any sort of transcendent force. I think it's also a bad idea to frame morality in any kind of absolute transcendent terms. This is another point of disagreement between Bob and me. I think we get into trouble when we try to convince ourselves that our sense of right and wrong has some sort of transcendent foundation. So I guess that's, I'll frame this as a question. Why? Why do you need, first of all, do you believe in God? I mean, what is it? What's your spirituality? And if so, why do you need it for this wonderful, optimistic, uplifting vision of our future that you have?
If you want the answer to that question, I'm afraid you're going to have to come to the 5th lecture. So there's a lot there. First of all, on my caginess, I take that as a compliment, but as for the question of why I equivocate, why in the next lecture I'm going to talk about reasons I think to suspect that there is a larger purpose at work. And I'm going to even use Richard Dawkins' the structure of his own argument to make that case. Why am I confining it to that and not telling you that I've seen God? Well, again, you'll have to stay tuned. But part of the answer is, what I'm doing here is developing a worldview that you can argue for. Okay? It cannot, it by definition cannot depend on special revelation, scriptural authority, or anything else. I think there's value in that, just as an intellectual exercise. Just saying, suppose we can confine ourselves to a scientific framework, what can we reasonably conjecture about the meaning of it all? Now, why I'm interested in the question, I'm sure it was because I was brought up Southern Baptist, but I also think it's an interesting question just intellectually. Aren't you curious? I mean,
as to whether God exists?
Well, anything, a purpose in any sense. I mean, you said there was a debate the other night about whether we are part of a simulation, in which case there would be a couple of hackers somewhere who created us. Well, that's one answer. That would be interesting to know, if that's the case, right? Whatever is the story, it is amazing that there's something rather than nothing. It is super amazing that it's like something to be alive. I talked about this in an earlier lecture. I made the argument that ironically, scientific progress has highlighted how amazing and mysterious it is that there is subjective experience. I won't rehash the argument, but that's totally amazing, and it's what gives life meaning, and we have no clue.
Right.
And that's worth pointing out, and I think figures into the argument of, well, maybe there's something more here going on in terms of the whole thing having a larger purpose or been set up or something, so now I'm not sure if you accused me of dabbling with transcendent stuff, I certainly didn't in this
Yeah,
talk.
I was accusing you.
Okay, but I didn't in this talk, right?
Well, bringing up Desjardins, that's
Well, right.
transcendent
Well,
stuff.
the reason I set up that table was to head off exactly the kind of interpretation perhaps you dozed during that part, but there was this thing where I said, I have a mechanistic explanation of what's going on. He appeals to the transcendent to explain it.
Right. But you were saying also that those aren't incompatible, the transcendent.
No, what I was
and
saying
the
was that a mechanistic interpretation is not incompatible with a larger purpose. The classic, the most straightforward example of that is deism, where God wound up the universe and let it go. It's clear that's a machine, but there's a purpose. Okay, so that's an example of reconciling a mechanistic worldview with purpose. You also kind of seem to equate my talking about moral truth with appealing to the transcendent or so on. Well, maybe, but by moral truth, I'm talking about something pretty concrete. The moral truth I'm confident of is that no one person is more important than any other person. And the fact is, we are designed by natural selection to deploy our moral sentiments as if it were the case that some people are more important. Us, our families, our friends, and so right there, I'm not saying I know the ultimate moral truth, but it's pretty clear what we could do to move closer to something that I consider a pretty plausible characterization of at least some of the moral truth, which is just like, you're not special, I'm not special, and the world should not be set up to serve relatively few people at the expense of a bunch of other people. So that's some of...
I guess it's a matter of rhetoric that I'm talking about. Your rhetoric seems to evoke some of these traditional hopes that we can find, that our sense of purpose and our sense of morality isn't entirely our own invention, that it is, I don't know, maybe in the sense of mathematical truths being transcended, at least according to some mathematicians, that it has some more durable existence beyond us. And I'm just, the older I get, the more I've become convinced that humility when it comes to trafficking and truth claims, and especially moral truth claims, humility is a very important virtue.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that the tribalism that you're worried about comes from people being pretty sure that they know how the world works. And there are secular versions of this. When you talked about Homo progressivus, I was thinking of socialists and communists who thought that they had the correct ideology under which humans could organize themselves socially and economically, and that certainty led to horrors. It was actually, Marxism was a great idea. It's still a pretty good idea. But the certainty of the Marxists ruined it, at least in, for most of the 20th century. The same obviously is true of religions. The same is true of scientific ideologies like eugenics and social Darwinism, which also became convinced that these are the correct ways of looking at human nature, and there should be consequences to this. And those consequences turned out to be disastrous.
I certainly agree on the importance of intellectual humility. Another little recap of the last couple of lectures is a value I ascribe to the new agnostics is intellectual humility. I even argued that, ironically, since Huxley coined the term agnosticism, science has given us more grounds for intellectual humility. Although scientific knowledge has accumulated, science has also highlighted so many imponderable mysteries, quantum physics and so on. Evolutionary psychology has highlighted what imperfect instruments our minds are, how riddled with bias and distortion they are. So there's that reason for intellectual humility. So I'm very big on intellectual humility, and I take your point. I think we are all susceptible to these tribalistic biases. I'm constantly fighting them. And I'm aware that when I think about the new atheists, I'm falling prey to them already, because it's them versus me, and I try to depict them in intellectually honest fashion, even though, of course, human nature militates against that when you view another group as a rival. So we do have to strive for that, and I take your point about the danger of certainty and too much confidence in your value system. On the other hand, if you don't believe in any values at all, I mean,
Okay.
right? I mean, we all do.
Sure.
We all do. And I think, I'd like to think that the values that I'm emphasizing are relatively humble values. I'm just saying nobody is more important than anybody else. Gratuitous belligerence is bad. And seeing things from the point of view of others is a valuable exercise that's often good for both of you, and things like that. Now, on the question of transcendent truth, do moral truths exist in the sense that mathematical truths do? Well, philosophers refer to that as moral realism. And I think that I haven't closed the door on moral realism. There are serious philosophers who, not on religious grounds, but on philosophical grounds, take seriously the idea of moral realism, of moral truth being a thing. And I guess I do think that, in some sense, it is out there, and in at least a kind of broad and minimalistic sense, it's possible to take a stab at characterizing it. So long as sentience exists on the planet, it's better for animals in general to feel good than to feel bad. And no animal is special,
The way I like the analogy, one of the reasons I use the analogy with mathematics is I think that the way I like to look at mathematics is that it is constructed. It's totally our invention. I don't agree with the Platonists who think that pi is waiting out there for us to discover. But here's how it's analogous to morality. That there are certain axioms that most of us can agree on. That pleasure is better than pain, and that killing is wrong, and so forth, and that certain people shouldn't be privileged over others just because of how they were born and those sorts of things. So we can start with some axioms, but those axioms aren't truths. Those are things that we agree on. That's how mathematics works as well. But on those axioms, you just sort of say, okay, here's some of my axioms. What do you think? You get common agreement, and then you can build up a reasonable moral system on those. But I just think it's a mistake ever to confuse that with genuine truth, which is what science discovers about reality.
Well, but the existence of consciousness itself tells us that there are things that are not amenable to traditional scientific exploration. Science can explore, can study things that are, as they say, publicly observable, by which they mean more than one person can look at them and they can compare notes. So even an electron, it's not publicly observable the way a statue in a park is, but more than one person can look at the same electron and they can compare notes. Subjective experience, nobody but me knows what my subjective experience is. So right there, you know that science is not going to give us a complete description of reality. And, there are philosophers who take metaphysics seriously, not as like a spooky, kind of new agey thing, but as a serious speculation about, in a certain sense, the underpinnings of the observable world, or the correspondence between the observable world and something deeper.
Right.
And I think that's, totally legitimate. Now, I'm mindful of the time. I mean, we should, before too long, probably wrap it up and open it up to questions from the audience, and then before too much longer after that, give people a chance to gracefully exit if they want to. But
I've got one more. I've got one more question I wanted to ask you about. It's about the omega point, and I was waiting for you to connect that to this new idea of the singularity. Has everybody here heard of the singularity? Has anybody not heard of the singularity?
Oh, I'm sure there.
Okay, so so the singularity, the basic idea, is a term from physics about when the laws of physics stop making sense. So black holes, the Big Bang, and so forth. And it's been applied to this idea that there's going to be some kind of super intelligence emerging very soon. Either computers are just going to do it on their own, or we're going to be cyborgs and we're going to have brain chips implanted in us. And, but something really dramatic is going to happen, and we're going to transcend our current selves. And dramatic forms of this, our psyches are extracted out of our bodies and downloaded into computers, and where we can all merge into one kind of mega mind. This is the extreme version of the singularity, and it's very similar to the omega point theory of Desjardins. And there was actually a physics version of the singularity that was called the omega point theory that was published in a book about, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago by Frank Tipler and John Barrow. I find it creepy. I want to remain, I don't want to merge into a giant meta mind. I find, in part because of my interest in mysticism, where the unification is held up as the ultimate good, I got turned off by that. And I am left with the feeling that I want to stick to my primitive individual self. So I just wanted to bring that up as something that your talk evoked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that conversant in the idea of singularity, but the part of it that has always seemed to me craziest is apparently, isn't the scenario like technological change starts happening faster and faster and faster and faster, and then nirvana, right? Whereas it seems to me that one thing you can say with confidence about technological change is that even if it's good in the long run, in the short run it can be very destabilizing, and human society can have a hard time accommodating it. So I do not see any need to accelerate technological change. And in fact, I've argued that, when you talk about global governance, and you talk about things like, for example, suppose you said, as I've said, that international trade accords should include environmental dimensions and even labor dimensions. So, for example, if nations that want to be part of a trade accord with us have to at least grant the right of unions to organize, and people say, oh, that kind of thing slows globalization down. I'm like, wait, globalization isn't going fast enough? I mean, seriously, the presidential election is showing us that change is happening at least as fast as it can be assimilated. So the idea of the singularity is that, like, hey, faster is better. I mean, I have no idea where, the plausible, I don't get, I mean, in addition, yeah, I'm skeptical of all the megamind stuff probably if I took a good look at it. But just the idea that, and again, I'm in many ways a lot of good to be said for technology, and I try to say it. And in any event, it can't be stopped. But the idea that faster is better seems to me naive.
By the way, the heads of Google are believers in the singularity.
Is that true?
Yes, and they hired the leader, the guru of the singularity movement, an engineer named Ray Kurzweil, to be their chief technology officer recently. So, to me, it's a crazy idea. It's a cult, but it's believed by some of the richest, most powerful people on the earth. That's why, as a science writer, I feel obliged to pay attention to it. Yeah. So I'm just pointing out that when you talk about the omega point, it's going to set off some associations in some of your audience.
That's true. I spoke at a conference organized by the Kurzweil organization. It's like the Institute for Accelerating Change or something. It's like 10 years ago. And Kurzweil, it's like acceleration of technology, wonderful thing. And Kurzweil was going to address this remotely by video hookup, and they couldn't even get that to work. So I took some heart in that, actually, that maybe things aren't moving as fast as I had feared.
Classic.
Okay, so why don't we, it's getting late. Like I said, let's take a few questions, and then we'll provide an opportunity for Exodus, and then if other people want to stick around and ask questions, they can. So, are there? Okay, these two right here, first the second row, then the third row.
Hi, I was going to say that the life that existed on Earth, let's say 1 million years ago, would not recognize us as their ancestors, or progeny, let's say. And wouldn't that trend tend to continue? So I guess I'm a little more pessimistic than you guys. I can't really, so what do you think life will look like in 1,000,000 years? And will it be a bunch of good Europeans, happy Democrats living together in peace and love? Or will they be so different from us to not share any morality, maybe even biology with us?
What do you mean, by the way, that past human beings would not recognize
Not human beings, the life on Earth.
Oh.
So whether it's bacteria, cells,
Right.
wild animals,
No.
would not recognize us.
Well, there
as-
were proto-humans 1,000,000 years ago.
That's
So-
fine. You can make it 1 billion if you like. But
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm just
billion.
asking a question about
Yeah,
time
billion, I
scales.
think you're, yeah. I'm
And
with
you know, I get the feeling from you guys that you think the future is just a somewhat better version of us. That's my
I
question.
think you're
Is it?
right. I was going to say, I reviewed a book by singularity-influenced futurists a few years ago called Year 1,000,000 or something like that. It was basically what's going to be going on 1,000,000 years from now. And it was all sort of, I don't know, whole planets that had been turned into giant computers and are thinking of it. My question is always, what will the giant planet or the giant galactic gas cloud be thinking about? I asked one of the leaders, one of the inspirers of the singularity movement, a physicist named Freeman Dyson, this question once. And what was interesting is that he hadn't really given it much thought. And so he thought about it for a second, and he thought, solving math puzzles.
And you know, I would say, I don't dismiss some fairly outlandish scenarios. I mean, look, Teilhard, it was a reasonable extrapolation back then. I mean, it was a non-obvious extrapolation to say more and more like a giant superorganism. The extent to which, you know, history has borne him out is kind of remarkable. I mean, the internet and so on. So I don't dismiss the further extension of this kind of thing. I don't even think in my wilder moments of speculation that it's crazy to think of a truly unified consciousness in the sense that it's like something to be planet Earth, you know, like that kind of consciousness. And that, I don't think that has to be incompatible with the continued feeling of individual consciousness, right? So like, if you believe that individual cells have some, you know, back when, like bacteria, have some measure of sentience, like you prod one and it feels a little crude pain, well then, when cells came together to form organisms, you know, you were integrating previously independently sentient organisms, and now there's this unified sentience. For all I know, my cells have independent sentience. It's not totally crazy to think there could be a global consciousness. You know, for all I know, there's one now. Who knows? But man, a few hundred years from now, at the rate things are changing, I don't know. But again, I think at a minimum, I'd like to keep the thing going long enough to find out, and that's what I'm focused on, because I think there are real perils to that. I mean, the great threat I see is that in responding to things like terrorism, we keep doing exactly the opposite of the smart thing, making the problem worse. You know, and people like Donald Trump start talking about, you know, whatever, doing whatever to Muslims that only makes things easier for terrorist recruiters and so on. So you get a positive feedback cycle where things, you know, get worse and worse and worse. I'm now responding in delayed fashion to your optimism about war ending. So I'm focused on the near term, and we can worry later about whether we turn into a giant superorganism, I think. I'd rather do that than just not exist. So there's a...
Yeah, in terms of the comparison between the math and morals, C.S. Lewis made the same comparison, and I tend to think that he's wrong, because if you break the laws of mathematics, then things that you're designing with math won't work, but society has broken moral laws for thousands of years, and they seem to relatively work. But what I really wanted to talk about was the Homo progressivus. It seems that I haven't read your articulation of the tribe within the tribe, but I guess I would trace that somewhat back to the Enlightenment, because it seems that was the first time where there were a number of thinkers who belonged to different tribes or different thought processes or spiritual backgrounds, but they seem to agree on some fundamentals. And it seems as though that group of people is always a very small minority, but they're able to, despite that, influenced the rest of humanity over time, and that humanity over time seems to share the values of the tribe within the tribe from a previous time period. My question specifically about resources is, how do you all see us moving forward as a species, overcoming, I guess, individual ego? Because it seems that more and more as a civilization, as a global civilization, we can agree on the fact that because someone's born into wealth, they don't necessarily deserve it more than someone who's born into poverty. But as you bring up Marx's ideology, the problem with Marx's ideology was what specific mechanism do you use to transfer that wealth from someone who has it to someone who doesn't have it? And it seems that Teilhard's kind of ultimate goal was kind of quasi-Marxist and believing that we'd have a society in which everything was one and everyone kind of had everything. But how do you see us overcoming those obstacles?
Well, we've got some work to do. At least we're paying attention to inequality right now, and I think that's a good sign. I'm not sure if Bernie Sanders is the answer. I'm still hopeful that we can solve that problem, and I'm in part because severe poverty has decreased as a proportion of humanity dramatically over the last few decades. And, so I see maybe some tweaking of the system we have. I don't think revolution has turned out to be a good idea. It's just too disruptive and destructive. So I think we can figure it out. We've got models in Europe of very highly functioning countries, very prosperous, with much less inequality than we have.
And on the question you raise about just, egocentrism and breaking that down, I mean, as a matter of spiritual practice, I'm again a big fan of meditation, and it's an explicit part of Buddhist philosophy that one of the aims of meditation is to break down what is considered in Buddhism kind of false conception of the self. But in any event, the practical payoff of that is to actually increase selflessness in a moral sense of that term. And look, you can find versions of this doctrine and of spiritual practices geared to it in the great faith traditions broadly. I mean, a problem tends to be that the people practicing the meditation aren't the people who are the biggest problem to begin with. Like you go to you go to these meditation retreats and they all have these bumper stickers about climate change and income inequality and stuff, and you're kind of thinking, I'll bet they had those bumper stickers even before they started meditating, right? So there is that, but at the same time, I mean, it's growing, and I do have some faith in just the power of getting the scientific knowledge out there, growing scientific knowledge about how the human mind is engineered by natural selection to mislead us in various ways, many of which are ultimately selfish. These various cognitive biases that exacerbate, strengthen this perceived line between us and them. In the long run, I'm hoping that scientific knowledge will kind of fuse with various kinds of spiritual practice and spiritual thought and lead to progress. But it's a huge challenge. So, are there any other? Why don't we just take these last three in succession without us immediately responding, and then we'll give each of us a last word, and then liberate everyone.
Thank you. Perhaps not so much a question, but my nostrum for making myself feel better when the world feels too much with me, which is to sort of adopt the stance, the voice of the narrator in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where, for reasons that I find very mirthful, but also very apocalyptic, he's describing this world that's been sort of wiped out, and the world that the character of Douglas Adams' novel knew is gone, but he's not gone. And in the movie, it's narrated by Stephen Fry, which is very wonderful to hear. And so I despair at times for the next train wreck you hear about. Sometimes it seems like evolution has been more and more transportation elements that can go more and more awry. But even when I hear these things, I do feel somewhat, I don't know if it's Buddhist, but a bit of detachment. Regret, mourning, grief for the suffering, but also we go on, it goes on, the world goes on. And sometimes it just makes me feel with a bit of distance.
Okay.
Sorry if that's not a question. But
I take your point.
Hi. Just so I understand the idea of the zero-sum, non-zero sum, is it the idea that civilization or Homo sapiens remain the same species over time, over the millennia, but the evolution of technology and science, that these create a situation in which there's less zero-sum thinking, more non-zero-sum thinking? And if that's the case, how does the model deal with the fact that the human species, with its aggression, drives for aggression, violence, etc., hasn't evolved? Is it really that the society or the civilization that, in effect, mutes those qualities?
And finally, one more.
Hi, this question is for Mr. Robert Wright. I know you don't want to attribute a certain direction, either fatalist or optimistic about history, and I think, and I'm just wondering if you would consider this an indication of a certain direction that, very much so in the same way that Joseph Campbell's concept of a hero of a thousand faces, that this, regardless of what societies historically have won out, that there is a certain narrative within that society with similar narratives of heroism, about justice, about equality, about inclusion, and that narrative, so if we can separate the victors of one religion versus another, the narrative is the same, and that is an indication of perhaps a certain direction.
Mm-hmm. Should I go?
You definitely go first.
You want to pick up the one final?
I want to know the real reason behind your optimism of progress. In Asia, at least we talk about among theologians, after Fukushima, we cannot do the theology in the same manner because we all have this nuclear power all around the world, and Fukushima happened not because some technical mistake, so-called natural disaster made this explosion, and it is just a kind of doomsday scenario. And Hollywood and popular culture, they talk about doomsday so much. And also climate change is, I don't think they are the Chardin. In their generation, they really think about this kind of Fukushima kind of nuclear disaster and climate change. So my question is, what is the reason for your optimism? It is like a human intelligence based on natural selection, evolutionary process, or do you believe that there are something divine, providence, or transcendental intelligence somewhere out there or within us? It will be connected and we will get this big awakening. So what is your real reason for this progressive vision of the future?
I'll answer I guess I'm
more
a
optimistic
more
than
hardcore optimist than even Bob. All right, so when I was a kid, I was terrified that the world would end at any moment because of a global nuclear war. We still have a lot of nuclear weapons, but many fewer. The Cold War has ended. All right, you know, Putin is a little bit of a scary guy, but the possibility of the end of everything is much less. The South was segregated when I was a little kid. I had a grandfather who lived in South Carolina. I visited and, you know, saw segregated restaurants and so forth. You know, girls getting an abortion was illegal in this country when I was a teenager. It was a really serious thing if a girl got pregnant. In just so many ways, things are so much better. Fukushima was terrible, but natural disasters in the past killed so many more people just because buildings weren't as strong as they are today. So that's, I mean, I see progress. That's really why I'm optimistic. And I'm not looking forward to some kind of, when I think of a utopia, I think of something like New York City, which is this really fractious place, incredibly diverse, but there are not people going around blowing each other up. I actually think human ego is going to be a constant. We're selfish, grasping, occasionally hateful people, but if we're not killing each other in massive numbers, then that will really be fantastic. If we're not diverting a huge proportion of our gross national income to creating giant death systems, then that would be a huge step forward, and I think it's very much within our grasp. Yeah. Yeah, human intelligence and basic moral decency, which is connected to intelligence. And you know, this is what Bob has written about so brilliantly, is, you know, that it's moral progress and rational self-interest are completely compatible.
Yeah, so again, I'm not as optimistic. In fact, you know, when the book Nonzero came out and people were talking about how optimistic it was, I actually, when the paperback came out a year later, I amended the introduction, and this was before 9/11, this was early 2001, to emphasize that I was saying that globalization had been essentially inevitable. There were inexorable forces that were at work, but it was far from clear we would respond to the challenges at the global level required to really consolidate a peaceful global society. There were problems peculiar to that level of organization. So I'm at best a guarded optimist, if that, but there are reasons for hope. One of them is human reason. You know, when it works well, again, we need to be mindful that it is naturally warped, right? The way we use it. The psychology, the so-called psychology of tribalism naturally warps it. But we have a lot to work with, and this gets at a couple of the other questions. So the question on, yes, I mean, I just to be clear, I am not talking about, with this whole zero-sum, non-zero-sum thing, I am not talking about biological evolution. I mean, you can apply game theory to biological evolution and use it to explain why biological complexity evolved, but that's not what I'm talking about tonight. I'm just talking about, in other words, I'm not talking about humans evolving biologically to get more cooperative. No, we all, human beings everywhere, have fundamentally the same human nature, and it is designed to help us cooperate under certain circumstances, and we have that to work with, you know, and we have the corresponding impulses of, you know, sympathy and so on that go along with that. It's a question of deploying them wisely, right? But there's a whole set of kind of moral intuitions, you might say, or inclinations that are the common heritage, the common biological heritage of humankind, and it's a question of using them wisely. And I think this also gets at the question of why you find common narratives in various cultures of, justice and equality. Well, I think the sense of justice is at some level innate. I mean, we all have a natural belief that, good deeds should be rewarded, bad deeds should be punished. That seems to be common to human cultures everywhere. There's a plausible evolutionary story as to why that might be. There's, hunter-gatherer societies are very egalitarian, by the way, in their professed ethos. They're very much against the aggrandizement of surplus. And there is, I think, there is an intuitive attraction to the idea that you should extend what you demand, that there should be a symmetry in moral discourse. I think that's natural. So, a lot of these impulses, I think, are the common heritage of people. Now, the dark side is, yes, we agree that one good turn deserves another. Bad deeds should be punished. Well, there are issues with how good a thing that latter belief is to begin with. But anyway, the bigger problem is that we all tend to convince ourselves that we're the ones who have done the good things and they're the ones who've done the bad things. That's an actual bias. So, that's what distorts the deployment of certain moral intuitions that might in themselves be more benign, okay? And then the first question was about distance and detachment. You get a certain consolation, I guess, out of being able to go, just extract yourself from all the suffering in the world and go, well, hey, we're still muddling through. I mean, we're surviving and it's going on. There is such a thing as being too caught up, so caught up in the troubles of the world that you just can't do anything, or that you cause yourself too much, a paralyzing amount of anguish. At the same time, there's such a thing as too much detachment. And one of the things that concerns me a little about meditation is, I think, and we had a whole panel discussion here in the fall about mysticism and activism, and the concern was that sometimes people become so at peace with the world that they don't feel any passion about changing it. And I think I've seen that happen with people. So I think that would be too much detachment in my view. I mean, I think the ideal thing is that when people get enough serenity to have a kind of objective view of the world, they use that objectivity, that degree of detachment, to get clear on what wisdom is. What is the wise way to proceed if you're not kind of so emotionally involved in it all, and then give people guidance or actively push, the causes that you conclude are in order. That would be my preference. So, is there anything else you want to say about this?
No, that's...
okay, so I want to say, first of all, I meant to mention more of, John mentioned his book, Rational Mysticism. I meant to mention more of his books when he came up, but most famous probably for The End of Science, but a number of others, including The Undiscovered Mind. Your End of War book, you're probably is one you're most passionate about promoting, probably?
It's the most recent, and the point of it, it's an extremely optimistic book. I'm arguing that war is, that we can get past this period of war and militarism, but as a first step, we need to think it's possible. So I'm a big believer in the power of wishful thinking. It's a term that's commonly disparaged, but I think all successful social movements, the end of slavery, civil rights for women, for blacks, for gays, started with wishful thinking in periods of our history when these goals look completely impossible. And so that's why every chance I get, I try to persuade people, because I know how the vast majority of you probably think that world peace is impossible. But I try to get you at least to question that belief. That's what I wrote this book for.
Okay. And blogs regularly for Scientific American, and very much worth reading, because he's not a cheerleader for science, as some science journalists are. And thank you all for coming in. So Tuesday, a week from today, my fourth talk. Thursday, the final one. I see some faces out there that I've seen before. Thank you for your attendance record. The end is near, I promise. So I'll be talking about purpose and consciousness next week. The final week, I'll cover God and salvation, and then, you know, and I'll do a kind of a grand summing up, and then we'll be done. But thank you so much for coming, and again, thanks to John Horgan for. Thank you, Bob.